back to cultural anthropology. We're at chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about cultural knowledge. And if you remember how we define culture as opposed to race, race is biological, it's genetically inherited. Culture is learned behavior. So you could be from any, what we talked about, there is only one biological race of humans. So that means any human, biological human, could learn theoretically any culture because it is a taught behavior. It's not something you're born with. There's a couple major ideas we're going to deal with, and these are like norms, values, and laws. And so norms is just like what it sounds. It's what is normal in your society, in your culture. That's what a norm is. Now, being the sophisticated postmoderns that most of you probably are, you're saying, oh, Blackburn, but what's normal? Well, normal, at least according to ethical relativism, is what your society, what your culture says is normal. And we have all been taught or enculturated from a very young age what is normal behavior and what is abnormal behavior. And that's why we can immediately identify if someone is acting abnormally in our culture. Now, normal behavior in our culture may be quite abnormal in another culture and vice versa. And so that's something you need to be aware of, especially if you're traveling or interacting with people from different places. But especially if you're in business or missions, evangelism, even just traveling, it would behoove you to do an overview of the country you're visiting and see what some of their basic norms are. For example, modesty. If you're coming from Southern California, even traveling in different parts of the country, you could really shock some people if you dress the way you normally dress here in Southern California. My recommendation is always dress more conservative, because usually people aren't offended or put off by people dressed more modestly or conservatively than them. It's usually if you're coming in under the bar. And then once you get to learn a place, its customs, you can adjust appropriately. Even things like eye contact. In our culture, we are taught from a very young age not to stare, right? How many times did your mom or dad tell you, don't stare, don't point? And we're taught to ignore unusual or abnormal behavior. And we're just supposed to act like, I don't see you walking around in a loincloth in Parkway Plaza. We just ignore it and hope it goes away. But in other cultures, they are taught to point out abnormal behavior. So norms are what is normal. And there's 3 criteria for them. There's widespread agreement on what is normal in your culture. You are judged based on how well you adhere to the norms. In other words, if you're behaving normally, you're going to be left alone. If you behave abnormally, you're going to get some pushback, or people are going to point you out or call you on it. And then thirdly, violators will be persecuted. And this could be legally, or it could simply be socially. People might be shunned. That is a major way that people are brought into conformity. When you're not acting normal, people may not want to sit with you in the cafeteria. They may not want to go on outings or dates with you. And so we use that sort of social distancing or exclusion to try to bring people into conformity. And I guess my next question would be, do you know your cultural norms? So let's start with like a broad view of America. What would be some American norms? And I'd like 3 examples, things that are normal in American society. Like, see, right now you just raised your hand before you spoke. That is like a normal conditioning in our culture, where we have been taught from a young age, from like preschool or kindergarten, to behave a certain way in class, right? If you're not the one teaching, you're supposed to sit there quietly, pay attention, not distract the teacher or your classmates. That would be normal behavior in an American classroom. But also in America, we have been taught to have like a rapport with our teachers, where you can ask your teachers question, you can ask for clarification. In Eastern education models, it would be seen as incredibly disrespectful to ask your teacher a question, because it would imply the teacher wasn't doing their job and they weren't being clear. Isn't that fascinating? And so I did not know that when I taught my first ESL classes. I had a class of 20 students. They were all Koreans from South Korea. They spoke English as a second language, but I could not get them to interact or dialogue with me because they were brought up that that was incredibly disrespectful to even ask for clarification of your teacher. You were just supposed to treat your teacher with reverence and deference and just nod and act like you understood what was going on. And you can imagine from my teaching style, that did not work. And so I had to learn how to teach Koreans, and they had to learn how to learn from a California professor who had a very different teaching style than what they grew up with. And in the end, we both learned a lot from each other, but that's one of the norms I'm talking about. But just so interesting, even things like education, teaching, learning. Let me give you another example. Besides staring, what's our norms about, and I'm talking pre-COVID, it's changing, but what were our norms about body space or personal space in our culture? At least the way I was brought up, and this goes all the way back to kindergarten, is we were taught to give each other dimes, like a full arm's length away from each other. You're not to be in other people's faces. You want to give them a lot of distance. And at least for me personally, I don't care if it's a student or a colleague or a stranger, if they're right up in my business, it makes me really uncomfortable. But in other cultures, it's more like Liz was saying, especially people you're close to, friends or family, you may be physically touching each other, that kind of closeness. But that is one of those things we learn culturally. How about eye contact? What are the American norms or California norms about eye contact?
You can have some, but not too much.
Okay, like a glancing contact, right?
Yeah.
But what
right,
are
Kendall.
you saying, Kendall, if you have prolonged eye contact with someone?
Oh shoot, I don't know. I don't know what it's portraying. I'd have to think about that. But I just
How
know
would you
people are like,
interpret it if someone, and would it matter if it was male or female? Would you feel differently if a
oh yeah,
female had long engaged eye contact or another male had long engaged contact? Would you interpret those two things differently?
I would assume that the female eye contact would be taken more as like flirting, because that's kind of what our culture has made it. And then for a guy eye contact, I don't even know. I don't experience that often. A guy staring into my soul for minutes on end doesn't really happen that often.
Normally, you are correct about the female or the different genders. It's usually seen as a come hither or a come on or showing an interest, right? But usually if it's of the same gender, I don't know, you females can educate me on this one, but when a guy makes prolonged eye contact with another guy, it's usually seen as a challenge. If you want to do a social experiment, I'm not recommending this, but if you got on the trolley in Santee and rode to downtown San Diego, you could try to have prolonged eye contact with different people on the trolley, and you could record their different reactions to you. But you may come back with a black eye or someone that wants to date you. So you have to be careful with these kind of social experiments. But that is another one of those things that in our culture, you're not supposed to look at people in the eyes, at least for a prolonged period of time. That's seen as it goes against our social norms. So everything from modesty to gaze to social distancing, we are taught these things from an early age on.